All right, all, we're starting. We've started. Hello out there, virtual land, and everybody in class today. Hmm. Nice chatting, listening to you chat, Brad.
Hi,
All
Dr.
right,
Sun.
so here we are. This is where we left off, everybody. This is the interesting part of the digestive system. It's all throughout the second of the three power points that are there, and I think you'll find it relatively interesting, hopefully, because it really explains a lot about all those adaptations for surface area and the intricacies that are involved within it, as well as looking at the complexity of the liver, also as part of it. So we did the pharynx already with respiratory. It's a shared system. So obviously the mouth goes to the oral and then the laryngopharynx and all the passage. And again, stratified squamous because it's more abrasive. Again, the protective feature is until we start getting into the complex nature of chemicals and the distinction changes. You see there's a very abrupt change between the esophagus and the stomach, and it's really dramatic. So, and again, you have these muscular layers that are there. They're the pharyngeal constrictors. So the inner layer, and this is a little bit different. The inner layer is longitudinal, and the outer layer is more encircling. So it's a little different than the classic inner circular outer, because we're not really relying on, remember, in most of the GI tract, it's inner circular, outer longitudinal. This flips it, because this is about propulsion. Not a whole lot happens in the pharynx other than pushing the food down toward eventually. So and we're going to see that more or less the transition arises in the lower one half to 1/3 of the esophagus, where we make the transition from actual forceful swallowing to peristalsis. So once it gets down that far, peristalsis kind of takes over. So there's nothing to say about the pharynx. Okay, the esophagus is effectively flat. It's this wonderful anatomical thing that you will see where the structure folds in on itself when it's empty and expands when it's full. And you're going to see almost identical anatomy, although different lining cells, when we get to the ureters. Okay, so the ureters are the passageways from the kidney to the bladder, and effectively they're just a conduit or a passageway. But because of the nature of this, you can see for yourself shortly how things get stuck. Okay, it's collapsed flat. We're not involved in propelling food. The most notable area, this is one of the three things that pierce the diaphragm. As I said before, the inferior vena cava and the aorta, and here the esophageal, and it's called the esophageal hiatus, hence the term hiatal hernia. And gastrointestinally is when we define hernias. Hernias are outpouchings of intestinal or gastrointestinal organs that have somehow pushed either upward through the hiatus, hence the hiatal hernia. So you get a little bit of stomach in the esophagus, not good. And it's not just for older folks. I've seen it in babies. Some kids are born with that and it has to be addressed surgically. Sometimes it's adults, sometimes you don't have to do anything about it. That's one hernia, a very famous sports hernia, which is a weakness in the inguinal ligament in the abdominopelvic in the lower area, rupture, whatever you want to call it. That's a different hernia where we get something that's going down under the inguinal ligament, typically in men in the spermatocord, but can happen in women as well. And then lastly, you have what's known as the umbilical and incisional hernias, which are very similar. The umbilical hernia typically is associated during the delivery process where there's a weakness and there's an outpouching of the umbilicus. If it's severe enough and doesn't retract, it has to be oversewn and pushed back in, so to speak, pushed back in and then oversewn. And an incisional hernia is when you have an incision like I do, right down the middle, that you're always worried that it's going to push out through. And again, that's the three things in surgery that guard against that are very easy. Technique, technique, and technique. It's like real estate, location, location, location. Surgery, you want to avoid problems, technique, technique, and technique. So moving on. So, and that's the opening is called the cardia. as we enter into the stomach, which you're going to see shortly. And so another term would be the cardiac orifice, which is an opening or an entry place. And we have, I got to leave my phone on a little bit because we're expecting a guy over at the house. So my wife might call me about something. I don't think it'll be right. I think it'll be later. So again, another name for it, the cardiac sphincter or gastroesophageal cardiac sphincter. And so again, this is not valves a la the heart. This is just thickenings of the smooth muscle that form a relatively secure area that doesn't permit opening. Mucus on both sides protect it. You're going to see that the mucus, when we get into the stomach, is highly alkaline, traps layers of bicarbonate within it and underneath it. And that's the big feature that prevents stomach acidity from being such a problem. Totally different lining, even though there's mucus, it's not alkaline mucus. So when you get reflux disease, which is sort of like a little bit of it sort of popping up, geysering up, whatever way you can identify it, when it squirts up a little bit, it doesn't take much to create what we call heartburn because of proximity to the heart. Whatever, everybody has a different term for it, whatever you want to call it. I love agita myself. Yeah, just me. Yes, sir.
So they said your acid reflux wasn't caused by H. pylori.
Pardon me?
So you said your acid reflux wasn't caused by H. pylori.
But I didn't get the last word.
H. pylori.
No.
So what caused it?
Oh, yeah, there's lots of different things that cause it. Most common thing that causes acid problems, I think, is non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. 70% of people who take frequent, regular, let's use the term that, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, aspirin, ibuprofen, naproxen, they're all in that particular category. They are all damaging to the gut lining. I think that's the major problem. I was tested for H. pylori a dozen times. I've had at least a dozen, endoscopies in that regard. Never, all negative. Giant ulcers, biggest ulcers anybody ever saw. So stress plays a role in it. Diet plays a role in it. Alcohol, if I drank, which I didn't, plays a role in it. Nicotine plays a role in it. Caffeine, use a lot of that, plays a role in it. And I'm popping pain pills like candy.
Does spiced food make?
Yeah, definitely does. Fortunately, now not so much. So I'm much more careful with that type of stuff. Hey, Cholula, baby, best hot sauce on the planet. You go out to Texas, California, mustard, ketchup, Cholula. On the table, baby.
Cured?
What? Cured? No, cured is no. I still have to be careful. I have to be careful. I get it periodically. I'll get it here periodically because I eat the wrong things or I get too much going by and there's irritation from it, all that type of stuff.
How long have you had it?
Long time. I first started getting symptoms of it probably as early as the early 80s. Okay. I was born with a narrowing just below what you'll see as the common bile duct. And so as it developed over time and got irritated, I only had about 1/8 of an inch opening for food to pass. That was what had to be bypassed. That's why I had to be on liquids for about 6 months. Like I had Thanksgiving dinner in 1992, 93 rather. I was all of 42 years old, consisted of me drinking water while everybody else was having turkey. It's not fun. I don't know if the turkey was that great. We were at somebody else's house. Can't tell you. Just saying. Hey, I've been there, done that. That's my other email. And it is LEWBTDT, Lou, been there, done that, at gmail.com. Hey, been there, done that. So moving on. Interesting question. Yeah, the H. pylori. If you said H. pylori is associated with gastric carcinoma, as there's a statistical relationship, I would agree wholeheartedly. I mean, gastric carcinoma, yeah, we see a lot of H. pylori. For everybody, if you didn't get it in micro, Helicobacter pylori is a curvilinear gram-negative rod that unfortunately it normally inhabits. It generates the enzyme urease. And one of the ways we test for it. And did you do a urease test in microlab? Okay, it's one of those many tests that you do to identify a bacteria. We had some here, but it was years ago when I was doing the lab. I had Mrs. Maurer order it. Urease breaks up urea back in from carbon dioxide and ammonia back to carbon dioxide and ammonia. So the carbonic acid it produces essentially creates alkalinity. That's why it can survive in stomach acid. It's not an acidophile. It doesn't love acid, but it has the urease capability to create an environment around it that keeps it relatively pH neutral. That's an interesting thought. And that's been a big player. For a long time, people were using antibiotics, broad spectrum antibiotics, a la, it's kind of like zithromycin, but it was a different erythromycin derivative that you took over 10 days, and another pill that they tried me on didn't do it. That was to deal with the acidity in the stomach. The name will come to me eventually. It was, I don't know, 30 plus years ago, roughly 30 years ago. So it's all about the muscle. The same 4 layers, except it's stratified squamous, abruptly change to simple columnar at the stomach. There are glands that secrete the mucus. They're basically lubricants. And you can see it's musculoskeletal muscle mixes in the middle. And when you get that bottom third, now it's smooth. Now we got peristalsis. And again, it's not designed to be sliding around. So it's not a moist lining. It's kind of a solid lining externally. And that's what I mean, that fan folding. So these little nooks and crannies that you can get things stuck in there, and that can certainly, but it's expansile. Again, go over to Home Depot or Lowe's. You get you advertise them on TV. Those hoses that squish down to almost nothing, put them in your pocket. That's it. Life imitates biology, imitates anatomy. So you can see the muscular layers, you can see the circular, you can see the longitudinal, you can see the submucosa. And it's just not as elaborate a mucosal layer because it's just stratified squamous. So they're just taking a snap in there. This is the abrupt transition. This is stratified squamous non-keratinizing. This is simple columnar. And these large indentations, simple columnar, all over, work your way down, another indentation. Those are called, and they're everywhere. There's zillions, millions of them, literally in the stomach. They're called gastric pits, P-I-T-S. When we get to the intestines, we have something similar, except they're called intestinal crypts. Like, hey, we just had Halloween. Tales from the crypt. I don't drink. Bela Lugosi, Dracula, 1931. Wonderful. No old-time horror fans? You're in Pittsburgh, the home of Chiller Theater. Didn't I tell you about that? I must have. After 11:30 or 12 on Sunday nights, they had Billy Cardilli. He was Silly Billy Cardilli. And he sold an old grade B, sometimes a grade A, horror movie at around midnight on Saturday nights. It was appointment TV. It was hysterical. He had a very interesting crew that did it and little commentaries on it. Like one of the greatest movies ever made. My personal favorite of the Frankenstein series. Okay, Bride of Frankenstein. There's a whole movie biography of that with Sir Ian McKellen. Okay, because it was based on a book. You guys have no interest in this whatsoever. Okay, it was with a. Here. Oh God, you're just no fun. Thank God.
Favorite series?
Yeah, it was this. Okay, this was the movie, and it's a fascinating history of it. Bride of Frankenstein. Okay, 1935, and the most famous, and Karloff, Elsa Lanchester played the bride, Colin Clive, alcoholic. She, a beautiful actress, married. There was a big scandal in England in the early 60s about her husband at the time. It was like early 60s. His name was John Profumo. He was a cabinet level minister, and there was a lot of stuff going on there that was very unpleasant for him. And here he's married to this beautiful woman. So all of that type of stuff. Una O'Connor, great character actress, she cackled. Go and watch Adventures of Robin Hood. Brilliant. And all of this came from this man. Okay, fascinating, from the mind of this gentleman, James Whale. And they did a movie about him because there's a book about him. There's a very famous line in the movie is of gods and monsters. And the movie, brilliant. Okay. So they'll have it down here. And I mean, unfortunately, he died. He was openly gay, which was very, very rare for Hollywood in there. So this was the subject of the novel Father of Frankenstein, and so The Gods and Monsters was he was nominated for an Academy Award. And the lady who played was the late Lynn Redgrave. And there was a very young Brendan Fraser, still in his Mummy day, prior to the Mummy, the action hero days. And it's absolutely brilliant about this. So it depicted what Hollywood was like. It's a great watch if you like it. Because they do little scenes from the movie with, they sort of make them up. And McKellen's just brilliant. Excuse me, it's amazing. I love this stuff. Okay, moving on. So much for that out there in virtual land. You have to put up with my interesting anecdotes. I can't help myself. Moving on. All that from the stomach. Heaven only knows when we get to the liver what will come to. So, moving on. So you can see the transition into the pits. So GERD, we use the term, reflux disease, all sorts of things. We can see them. There's any one of a number of things that can cause problems with this. The hiatal hernia is the protrusion. This is the big problem. You get esophagitis. That's what the heartburn is. It can cause an ulceration, and unfortunately, they have a strong tendency to become cancerous. And that's that's not a good cancer to have. It's a tough diagnosis. After the third most common cancer that people get is gastrointestinal. So you have basically lethal cancers. So you have lung cancer, and either breast or prostate cancer, depending on gender. And then finally, gastrointestinal cancers. Swallowing is called deglutition. I don't do these. This is physiology. I don't do the phases. I don't care. It just gets down there. Here it comes. And you can see the sphincter, just the thickening being closed. Now it opens, and small amounts are designed to go through. And you want to go through these slides, that's fine. But here's where we're going. And it's a very apt description, a temporary storage tank. You're storing it in there, it expands dramatically. Typical stomach empty probably only has 2 or 3 ounces in it. Yet it can stretch to a gallon. That's the reason why I can still eat, though I can't eat as much at a given time. I have to do the small meals frequently. Because the whole idea is it's stretchy. So when they cut away half of it, it expanded again. When they cut away another half of it, it expanded again. So maybe my gallon capacity is now a quart capacity, but you kind of get the idea. And the end product of all of this is where, most importantly, proteins start to digest. Up until this time, we've just started starches, in the mouth with something called salivary amylase. We've started fats with lingual lipase. There's a little more fat digestion here, but the big players were starting to break down the proteins. And the end product of this multiple hours, typically average maybe 4 to 6 hours of going back and forth with peristaltic motion. And you're going to see an interesting anatomical anomaly is the wrong word, difference between the usual construction of the layers here. So you can see empty, barely 2 ounces. expanded 4 liters. That's a gallon. And so again, just like you saw in the esophagus, you have these folds. You'll see these in the bladder as well when the bladder is empty, because that's what smooth muscle does. And again, it's that folding is the way that we can expand and contract and still have adequate surface area. And they have a wonderful name. They're called rugae. If you're going to say rugae, you have to, and I can't do it. It's like in Spanish, you have to roll your R's. Okay? Ruffles have ridges. Good. No potato chip fans. Oh, oh, oh. That's not very wise. Oh, sure.
Potato chips aren't that good.
What?
Potato chips aren't that good.
Oh, no. Like if you have a little cheddar ruffle.
Oh yeah, the cheddar
like
ruffles.
some French onion dip.
Oh yeah, happy days.
Yeah.
And how do you stay so skinny?
I go to the gym every day.
I drive by it every day.
That's enough. That's more than some people do.
I got my app. I go there every so often. Well, I used to go 560. My wife got me started when I was really at terrible shape. Terrible shape. I couldn't walk up a flight of stairs. She was one of those work. My daughter's like that, crazy person. I told you. At 5:30 in the morning, they're very good friends with the people who own that. What's the name of it? Arnold's Athletic, whatever it is. Alexander's Athletic Club, Harmerville. So they're buddies. So the cardia is the entry level. Cardiac orifice. You'll see this saying fundus is a dome-shaped portion. The uterus has a fundus. Fundus just indicates a dome-shaped portion. This one is kind of assumes the shape of the diaphragm. The body is the major player where the mixing goes on. As it narrows, it becomes the pylorus, wider and then narrows into something called the antrum, and eventually the pyloric canal and the pyloric sphincter is where it exits. And that sphincter or valve is just the same thing as the cardia. And so it's a great illustration, and the big difference here is that we have underneath the circular and the longitudinal layers, we have the oblique layer. So let's just move over and back, over and back, over and back, as well as peristaltically over these rugae. Like obviously until it's just stretched as much, but eventually it will empty and it will keep growing over. And this effect is kind of like, if you remember the old days, we had a thing called a washboard. You know, if you have an old sink down in the basement, it's got the ridges in it. My grandma had a washboard, and something called bluing, just in the washing machine days. I think I told you, my mom got a new refrigerator for her 20th anniversary. That's my dad, always the pragmatist. I said, it's a fridge. It was 20 years. She goes, that's just what I wanted. And so the shape is rather, so here's the fundus, the dome, under the diaphragm, not quite joined to scale. You can see how it begins to narrow. And then this is the sphincter area. And the whole idea of this journey is pulverizing and creating like a pasty substance, highly acidic, because the stomach is filled with hydrochloric acid, pH1, pH2. You don't even want to get it on your fingers, along with enzymes and a variety of other chemicals. And it plays a vital role, as you will learn in physiology, immunologically. It's why we can eat a lot of things, that aren't necessarily sterile, but the acidity will destroy a great deal of it. That's there. If nothing else, when you deal with the physiology of the gastrointestinal system, pH and osmolality and stretch are the big players that we associate with. So there it is again. Just to go back real quick, this is the greater curvature. This is the lesser curvature. There's tissue between the lesser curvature and the liver that sort of overlies it over here. And then there's also kind of hanging down from the greater curvature. It's like, think of it as an apron that you'd wear if you had like a little waist apron that you put on in the kitchen. I made some kick-ass chicken taco soup.
Chicken taco soup?
Yeah. You take like a Costco chicken and you make stock out of it and preserve the meat that you have left over, and onions, peppers, garlic, rotel if you're inclined. Happy dance. And little taco seasoning, cream cheese, little heavy cream. Necessary, you can always get the boat motor out, immersion blender. Outrage, and you crunch up some taco chips in there. Great recipe. I always tell my wife it's so hot it'll put hair on your chest. She goes, "That's not the look out. That's not what I'm looking for." Moving on. Just shut up. Nobody cares. So here they are: greater and lesser curvature, mesentery. So again, it's this layer of it really folds of visceral peritoneum with blood vessels, lymphatics, nerves, etc. The lesser omentum is from the lesser curvature to the liver. The greater omentum drapes, and that's the kind of thing that we preserve. It's got all sorts of blood vessels and nerves and lymphatics in it. So if you're operating on somebody in that area, you have to reflect that or pull that out of the way and put it back where it belongs, because it's a barrier between the exterior of the abdomen and the organs. And the single greatest problem that abdominal surgeons have is a very fancy word. It's called adhesions. And adhesions means things stick to each other or stick to the wall. And when that happens, you got to go back in there and fix it. It ain't fun. So, I mean, that's the whole idea of being understand. That's why my 2 surgeries each took 8 hours. Meticulous, slow, perfect. So, and a lot of things, you're going to see the mesocolon is mesentery, that the large intestine, that sort of anchors it, makes it somewhat retroperitoneal. There's lots of fat, there's lots of lymph nodes. When we do the physiology, the autonomic nervous system is what keeps it, is really deactivates it, and the sympathetic slows it down. Blood supply we talked about before. It's got the same tunics, okay, in addition to the oblique. And it effectively, it moves it, but it pummels is a great word. Okay. So it's mostly mechanical and some chemical that we will get to. And I think that's an important aspect as well. Okay. So simple columnar, you saw the transition, a 2-layer coat of alkaline mucus, because it's making the mucus and it also traps it underneath it. And it has these gastric pits. So it's like you took like there's a cooking tool that like if you're making like chicken fried steak, that you can punch holes in it. It's like little pins. You've seen it? You watch cooking shows. I can tell. I've had chicken fried steak in Texas. Oh my God. Oh, Stephenville. Oh, was that great? Stephenville is like a rodeo area. My first wife's and our friends used to live there. We went to this. Oh my God. It's that good.
Sounds good.
Yeah, it's these little hole in the wall places. Like we're Pepsi here, they're Coke there. Gravy, you could just cry over.
So hard to eat clean in the US.
What?
It's so hard to eat clean.
No, you can't.
Yeah.
They can't. It's not. It's not. It's very, very hard. It tastes so good, but it's never good for you. Okay, moving on. So gastric pits, which lead into the gastric glands, and they produce the gastric juice. This is important anatomically for us. So it's littered with these pits. So they have lining cells, the standard simple columnar, and then you're going to see some different cellular elements. And now this is all part of the mucosa. You have the muscularis, you have the lamina propria for all the functionality, and then we have the submucosa and the layers, et cetera, et cetera. So there are 4 types of cells that you should be familiar with. Mucous neck cells, we still don't know what they do. Parietal cells, they make 2 things. They are the cells that generate the acid. Okay, and they make intrinsic factor. An intrinsic factor is something that's essential if you're going to digest by way of ingestion and process and absorb vitamin B12. If you do not have that, or if they do not make that, then you have to get a different way to get B12, whether by injection, by there's nasal spray, there's different ways to get it into your bloodstream. Okay. B12 is interesting. We'll get to that in the blood. Very famous kind of anemia from that is called pernicious anemia. I take B12 chewies every day because I probably have less intrinsic factor than I need. So the parietal cells are very important, and this is where what we call proton pumps. If you know somebody who has stomach problems and they're taking a Protonix agent or Nexium or Prilosec, which you can get over the counter, those are proton pump blockers. That's how they work. They block that. It's a very interesting mechanism because effectively we're doing an exchange based on and we'll get to this more in physiology, that bicarbonate exchange. That's where we start to really utilize that the bicarbonate, the carbonic acid buffer. So we grab the proton from that, grab the chloride from these pumps, make hydrochloric acid, and the blood flow becomes very alkaline to offset. It's called the alkaline tide. Okay. Not to be confused with the Alabama football team, which is the Crimson Tide, of course. Sorry, channeling my inner Bear Bryant. Yeah. First university in the SEC to integrate. Bear Bryant, who was this, he looked like he was just typical Southern, but he was very progressive. Not pleasant. Chief cells. Guy's name is on the tip of my tongue. Running back. Oh, I gotta remember. So chief cells make hepsinogen. This is when your introduction to enzymes. This is a proteolytic enzyme precursor. Enzymes, once they're active, are indiscriminate. If it's going to break down proteins, it doesn't matter what protein it is. So pepsinogen means it's an inactive precursor. When you lop off some of polypeptide chain, you activate it into pepsin. At that point, it'll digest any protein it comes in contact with. So when you hear about somebody with, that's why I commented on perforated stomach, it pours out this activated pepsin. Is activated by hydrochloric acid, and it's just gobbling up organs. It's gobbling up. You're you're made of proteins. It destroys it. That's a horrible thing. And we'll see the same, and the pancreas is the same thing. The pancreas makes tons of proteolytic enzymes, peptidases, carboxypeptidases, trypsin, chymotrypsin, all of those, when they are released, and they're released with trauma, okay? Or alcoholism will release them. That's one of the things we see pancreatitis. My ex-wife had an abdominal tumor removed in 2004. And when they extirpated the tumor, which is slightly smaller than a softball, she's tiny. It was like behind her pancreas. She ended up going back in the hospital with acute pancreatitis. I've never seen anybody in so much pain. Double over, and nothing you can do about it. Fluids, pain med, tincture of time. It's awful. So we'll move on to all of this. So here's the look. Here are the pits, regular lining, mucous necks, parietals in a sort of bluish, chief cells, purplish, and this green guy down here. It's called a G, like in capital G. It actually stands for gastrin, Gastrin. They're also known as enteroendocrine cells. Endocrine substances travel typically through the bloodstream to target cells. In this case, the target is itself. And what it does is it's produced by the stomach, and it targets the stomach to increase stomach activity. So when chemicals go in, when it's stretched, when different particles will basically trigger the base of this area to make chemicals that induce it. It's like, well, hey, we just got some food in here. Everybody get busy. It's like, company's here, and you start running around and crazy. That's what your stomach does, the same thing. It's having a party. Hey, somebody just went out for tacos. We're ready. I know. Yeah, we haven't been there yet. They opened a Condados up by us. Tried to get in there one night. Not there. Down in downtown. Well, we have an hour and a half wait. Really? For a taco? I'll make it. Mucous neck cells, unknown function. Parietal cells, hydrochloric acid eventually. Fairly low pH, denatures proteins. It's the first start, so it starts to work on it. And not only denature proteins, it's highly effective against microbes. Activates the pepsin from its pepsinogen. Cellulose, plant cell walls, lots and lots of bacteria. Because other than that, we'd have a very difficult time processing through. We can digest partially. We certainly cannot absorb the cellulose aspect of it. So, but we need to make the cellulose, so as we're fond of saying, this too shall pass. Well, cellulose plays a double duty role. I mean, it's mechanically a bulk agent, and it also facilitates the removal of things as it passes through. And the intrinsic factor for absorption of B12, I told you about. The chief cells, the inactive form of the enzyme, activated, and interesting, a little positive feedback loop by hydrochloric acid and pepsin itself. Pepsin that has been formulated helps to sort of re-trigger more pepsinogen, and it keeps doing that until such time as things start to empty out of the stomach, and some gastric lipases that play a role with lipids. The enteroendocrine, these are the big players when it comes to your stomach. Okay, the chemicals work on the stomach in the lamina propria underneath the lining, and they're paracrines because they work alongside. Para meaning next to. So serotonin, which if you don't know by now, is a very important neurotransmitter, but it works in blood clotting. It works in a variety of different areas. And histamine, that's why if you get Tagamet, which is the first one of those to come out, okay, and you can still get these antacid, antacid is the wrong term, but they're heartburn medications over the counter, not the Prilosec, not the blockers. They work on what are called H2 receptors. They're antihistamines. Like antihistamines like Zyrtec, that type of thing, Claritin, that's a different histamine receptor. H2 are the gastric. They block that particular receptor. And somatostatin is actually anti-growth hormone. Your body, when you eat, it gears itself for metabolizing carbohydrates. So growth hormone metabolizes fat. So it's basically saying, hey, I'm having dinner. I'm going to use insulin. So, and it's like a tug of war between growth hormone and insulin. So, but when we're ingesting, it's mostly insulin. And that's why growth hormone and things that simulate growth hormone or quote unquote anabolic steroids, why they're such a good tool, and we go over this again in endocrine, because they build muscle, they repair things, and what do they use as an energy source? Fat. So it's lean muscle. It's, should get some. Opportunity to thank you. One person smiles. You're looking at me quizzically.
Sorry.
Hair's a little different today.
Just my hair.
Yeah, it's pulled back.
Oh, yeah.
I don't see it that often like that.
No, it's usually that.
Not that I noticed.
Oh, right. Okay. Sorry. Your hair looks different today.
Because I got a haircut. Or as I said, I didn't get them. I got them all cut.
Yeah. I noticed. Don't worry.
Thank you. Shut up. Nobody cares. Nobody thinks you're funny. Here's the hydrochloric acid. Mucosa, the barrier. Okay, so the stomach is protected. Okay, bicarbonate rich, Tight junction. This is where this is where the non-steroidal anti-inflammatories come in. So I can't even tell you how many pain pills I used to take. And bad ones and addictive ones. Okay. And terrible. So the tight junctions are critical. We hear about tight junctions. That's why the anatomy and the lining cells are so important. Tight junctions mean water or fluid type. Those are the cells that are targeted by non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. There's a reason why certain things work more rapidly than you would think. Normally, it takes hours to get things through the stomach and absorb. Some things work faster. And most of the time, if they work faster, it means they're penetrating that barrier, and facilitating absorption in the stomach. Okay. They quickly, and again, every 3 to 6 days, the entire gastrointestinal tract. So it's continuously billions of cells daily. So anything that breaches it. So peptic or gastric are the same thing. Duodenal is specific to the duodenum, the start of the small intestine. So the erosions perforate, and if they do, then you get the stuff flowing into rather than falling into the cavity as well as blood, and that's life-threatening. And see, this is where I take issue. It's not most ulcer. Again, if they said most gastric carcinoma, I'm with it. But 90% of us have Helicobacter pylori in our stomachs. 90% of us don't have ulcers. Is there a correlation coefficient? Yeah. Correlation coefficients in research are not nearly as reliable as other studies. It's like big men have big feet. Who cares? What's a high correlation coefficient? I don't care. Okay, so think of these things. NSAIDs, the acronym for non-steroidal anti-inflammatories. I had a dozen of those. That's what an endoscopy looks like. I remember the guy, and it was over at the old, I don't even know if it's a hospital cell, in New Canaan. He was working out of Citizens. Really smart guy. And I came out of the anesthesia. You're not asleep, but you're kind of in la-la land. And he goes, your stomach's a train wreck. There's 12 ulcers in there. So and you're losing blood through those as well because it's seeping out. That's the Helicobacter pylori. You always see this illustration. Again, they're curvilinear, gram-negative. Okay, and it goes through all this types of stuff. So what does it do? Mostly mechanical, holding because it takes a while to empty. Chyme is squirted out, very small amounts, because it's so acidic, it's so hyperosmolar, has so much hyperosmolarity that it immediately triggers a rapid response. The hydrochloric acid, enzymatic digestion of proteins. In infants, it's a little bit different, okay? So it's not quite the same. They're relying less on the acid and more on the renin that's there, which is different from the renin we're going to talk about when we start getting to kidney. That has one N. I always misspell it, so if you're not sure, check. And that's milk protein, that's casein. So, and that plays a role with a lot of milk's properties. Alcohol, aspirin, caffeine-containing substances, all are potentially ulcerogenic. So I usually tell people no alcohol, no smoking, no caffeine-containing compounds, no NSAIDs. That's the usual quote-unquote lifestyle type of changes that you would recommend. It's also why if you wonder why alcohol goes to somebody's head rapidly, it's because it does this, okay? And carbonated things faster. So if you're having a single malt, it would not hit you as fast as, say, a vintage champagne. Little Moet Chandon. Just saying. Tattingers. I give up.
We're all like tired today.
Manishtana halila is that. That means why is it In Passover, we asked, that's one of the 4 questions. Why is this night different than any other night? Why is today different than any other day?
A lot of us have.
Who cares? This is your job. This, Godfather 2, this is the business you have chosen.
You don't come to class some days. You
Right.
feel like it.
Right, and because I'm old.
Oh, okay. Jordan's old. She's still got.
She's not that old. I have clothes older than she is. I think I'm wearing socks that are older than she is. I didn't know you didn't like her. You just said bad things about her.
Yeah, all the time.
Terrible person.
I know.
Moving on. Okay, we don't know none of that, 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 none of that. We do it, but not now. Okay, and we'll get to the enterogastric. These are the substances when the food enters the small intestine. Immediately, it starts making secretin and cholecystokinin. Cholecysto means gallbladder. Kinin makes it work. So one of its actions is to squeeze bile out of the gallbladder. Secretin sort of energizes the small intestine as well as the pancreas. And they have a nice summary event for this type of a thing. We're almost done with today. So you can look through all of this. This is more physiology than anything else. This is physiology. This is the parietal cells from carbonic acid. When it breaks apart, remember the carbonic acid buffer. It takes the hydrogen by way of what are called, and this is where we see proton pump blockers, like those kind of like Prilosec, the original one of those. And so the hydrogen is pumped in and the bicarbonate is exported back out to the blood. Okay. And it's an antiporter between chloride and bicarbonate. So the chloride and the H plus make the hydrochloric acid. So the blood leaving has, and you're going to see it reverses in the lung to some extent, the alkaline tide. And you go through, and we'll go over all that again. But just to give you an idea, and then these are just the type of things that go on and how it eventually moves stuff through, so to speak. And this is what happens when you put effectively, it is reflexes in general are protective. So if you put too much in, you might vomit. Something that's irritating, something that's toxic. Spicy foods, certain agents are like that. So they'll stimulate, once that irritation, the emetic or vomiting center. The problem is particularly in the very old and very young is acid-base imbalances and fluid and electrolyte imbalances. So there's real problems associated with that. When I had salmonella infection, that I mentioned that already. Always do. I have a lot of classes. I have more next time. They're making me teach more, not less. Okay, well, we'll stop here before we get to the liver. It's crazy, Doctor. I'm with an advisee, and Dr. Badger knocks on the door. He goes, Lou, I need to talk to you for 10 minutes when you're done. My first thought is, what did I do?
You already said that story.
I did. What did I do?
Nothing good.
Oh, I got it. I'm all right. He just gave me another lecture.